we see that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really map out how the Christian life is worked out. Abraham represents having to believe God's promise in spite of having nothing, and being justified while having nothing. He didn't have anything that looked like what God had promised for a long time. A quarter of a century between the time God promised and the time things started actually happening and Isaac was brought forth. And he had to walk by faith. But he also had to overcome his own strength, and that's what circumcision represented in his life, was I'm going to stop producing Ishmaels. We're going to cut off my ability to produce, and I'm going to wait for God to visit me at the time of life. And when he does, what's coming is the seed to whom God made all these promises, and ultimately that seed is Christ. And that seed, Isaac, became the heir of the promise. So we walk by faith, and not by sight, and that's like Abraham. But then as Isaac, we are the heirs. We were born in the time of life by the Word. The Word came and visited Abraham. Actually, it was a person. And promised, and then the Word came and visited Sarah in the time of life and fulfilled and brought forth Isaac. And that's how we were brought forth. And when we were brought forth as the heirs. But we need to be attached to the promise, not to Sinai, not to Hagar. And not only that, but we need to be separated from Hagar and her seed. Eventually she has to be cast out, so does the child of the flesh. And that talks about our flesh, our need for the flesh to be dealt with, and our legalistic approach to the Christian life. We need to see that we are heirs. We need to see we're legitimate heirs. And then the process that we go through to discover that, really you see in Jacob. Jacob was an heir by God's decree, but lived as if he had to lay hold of it through works and conniving, and swindling and doing everything he could in his natural strength to make things happen. And he couldn't stop that. That's just who he is. That's what the flesh is. You don't have the ability to stop being an Ishmaelite. You don't have the ability to stop being a legalist. You don't have ability to stop your natural strength. Your natural strength is just what it is. It's strong. That's who you are in the flesh. You need to be transformed. And for that, God has to visit you. And, we see that with with Jacob, that God visited him and wrestled with him until finally, because Jacob was too strong and couldn't stop wrestling, God weakened him in the thigh, and then he still wouldn't let go. And he said, "You must bless me." Then he named him Israel. And when he got up, he was never able to walk in his natural strength again. He had to rely on a staff, representing what transformation really does, and what circumcision really does, and what really it means to be cut off from Ishmael. You can't do it yourself. God has to do it. We understand the principles, but God has to work, And in all three cases, you see God sustaining them. And you don't see them doing much. But Abraham believed the promise, eventually, in spite of having nothing, and gave glory to God, who calls those things that are not as though they are. He gives life to the dead, counted not his own body as though dead, nor the barrenness of Sarah's womb, but was firmly persuaded that what God had promised he was able to do. And he even partook of the covenant of circumcision as a sign of, look, I'm cutting off my own natural ability to make something happen. And I agree with God's judgment on Ishmael. He's going to have to go out of the house. And then Isaac, being the heir, really there's not a lot of activity with Isaac, other than there's some stories about how he inherited these wells, and the Philistines kept putting dirt in the wells, and he kept digging up the wells to get the water flowing again. And that is, what we are doing. We are enjoying our inheritance, but we have to brush it off sometimes. But then Jacob represents, and he had to be separated from Ishmael, right? But Jacob really represents the weakening of the flesh and the dealing with the flesh, the reality of circumcision, transformation, and a new name. And then out of Jacob comes Joseph, who's really the blessed one. And that is the trajectory of our Christian life. If you want to know what the Christian life looks like, it's Christ, who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's what it means that I through the law, died to the law, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And there's a journey to reach that point, to where you can boldly say that, and it's called transformation. Israel represents transformation.